What if the most explosive royal secret of the decade was never hidden in some locked vault behind palace walls, but instead kept quietly inside one woman's memory, waiting for the exact right moment to detonate? What if everything you thought you knew about the dynamics between Sarah Ferguson, Meghan Markle, and Prince Andrew was only the polite, polished, sanitized version, carefully arranged for public consumption? While the real story was simmering just beneath the surface, burning hotter each year, until it finally forced its way out. And more importantly, why is Sarah Ferguson choosing to speak now, after years of silence, restraint, and suspiciously timed denials? That's the question nobody seems ready for, but it's the only place this story can begin. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because if Sarah's revelations are even half as intense as insiders claim, then we are dealing with something far bigger than royal gossip. We're dealing with a subterranean truth that challenges the polished image of two people who, on the surface, should have never had anything more than a passing acquaintance. And yet they did, repeatedly, privately, intimately, at moments when nobody else was supposed to be watching. But someone was. Before we go any deeper, let me ask you something. Have you ever looked at a situation that seemed perfectly innocent at first glance, only for something in your gut to whisper, "This doesn't add up"? That was Sarah's experience. Again and again, over years. It wasn't one moment of suspicion. It was a slow accumulation. A flicker of eye contact that lasted too long. A strangely timed text message. A door closing more quickly than usual. A conversation that ended the second someone else stepped into the hall. A pattern that didn't make sense. Until suddenly it made far too much sense. This is where our story takes off. To understand how seismic Sarah's revelations are, you have to understand the atmosphere in which they were born. The royal family, for all its grandeur and ceremonial tradition, is an ecosystem filled with fragile egos, shifting alliances, vindictive rivalries, and unspoken debts. People don't just coexist, they maneuver. They calculate. They observe. They collect information because information is a form of power, and power inside the royal orbit is everything. Every smile has a motive. Every silence has a meaning. Every relationship, public or private, is a negotiation, whether anyone admits it or not. So imagine someone like Meghan Markle, someone ambitious, someone charismatic, someone disruptive, entering a world where relationships are currency, and every interaction has consequences. And imagine Prince Andrew. Someone controversial, someone scrutinized, someone diminished by scandal, encountering someone who, from the moment she stepped into the room, refused to treat him the way everyone else did. It's not hard to see how two people from such different corners of royal life could end up forming a connection that defied logic, tradition, and expectations. But here's the thing audience members always forget. Sarah Ferguson has been in that world long enough to know when something isn't normal. She knows the difference between polite friendliness and inappropriate closeness. She knows how quickly private moments can spiral into something else. And she knows what it means when two people look at each other like there's a secret only they share. That is exactly what shook her. Because Sarah didn't begin with distrust. She began with curiosity. She didn't want to see anything suspicious. She didn't want to interpret gestures the wrong way. She didn't want to assume anything beyond innocent interactions. But the more she observed, the more she noticed, and the more she noticed, the harder it became to pretend the signs weren't there. You have to ask yourself, at what point does curiosity turn into concern? And when does concern turn into fear of what you might discover if you keep looking? Sarah reached that point quietly, long before the public ever suspected a thing. She began cataloging moments in her mind. Small interactions that raised an eyebrow, unusual coincidences, comments that sounded lighthearted on the surface but carried strange emotional weight beneath them. Meghan standing a little too close during a joke. Andrew laughing a little too loudly at something that wasn't funny. A private meeting Meghan requested at Royal Lodge for reasons that didn't make sense to anyone else. A certain hush that would fall whenever Meghan and Andrew slipped out of a crowded room and reappeared minutes later looking ever so slightly different, flushed, breathless, unsettled. It didn't happen once. It didn't happen twice. It became a pattern, a rhythm, a quiet dance performed behind the scenes, invisible to the public but obvious to anyone with the experience to recognize when a boundary has been crossed. And Sarah had that experience. She wasn't looking for drama. She wasn't hunting for secrets. She wasn't trying to expose anything. But at some point, the truth forces itself onto your consciousness. It leaves you with a choice: ignore it or confront it. And ignoring it wasn't an option for her, not when the signs kept intensifying. Because Meghan wasn't just forming a strange connection with Andrew. She seemed to be doing it deliberately, strategically, almost like she was positioning herself in a place where Andrew could offer something she wanted. Whether influence, protection, validation, or something more personal. And Andrew, who had been increasingly isolated, increasingly criticized, increasingly pushed aside by the palace machinery, seemed to welcome the attention in ways that were not only unwise, but unpredictable. Now ask yourself, if you were Sarah, someone who knows both individuals extremely well, someone who understands their instincts, their weaknesses, and their motivations, would you stay silent? Would you pretend nothing was happening? Or would you begin quietly documenting what you saw, not because you wanted to use it, but because you feared you might need proof one day? And that is exactly what she did. The most fascinating part of this story isn't the interactions themselves. It's the timing of Sarah's revelation. Why now? Why this moment? Why this climate? Why this tension in the wider royal world? Why is she willing to risk backlash, scrutiny, disbelief, and accusations by stepping forward with something so explosive? It's because the truth is no longer containable. Something pushed her to speak. A trigger, a moment, an event that forced her hand. Something that made silence unbearable and truth unavoidable. This introduction is your foundation for what comes next, but make no mistake, we have barely begun. The real story unfolds in what Sarah witnessed behind closed doors, in private rooms, in quiet corners of palaces and lodges where no cameras are allowed and no protocols protect reputations. The story deepens in the text messages, the glances, the whispers, the unguarded moments that told Sarah she wasn't imagining anything. And it explodes in the aftermath, when a single decision, a single confession, a single slip in judgment causes everything to come crashing down. But before we go there, let me ask you one final question. If Sarah Ferguson truly knows what happened between Meghan Markle and Prince Andrew, what exactly did she see? Because according to her, the answer is something nobody is prepared for. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if the first sign of a secret wasn't a dramatic moment, a scandalous scene, or a hidden document, but a single whisper carried across a hallway, barely audible, easily dismissible, yet powerful enough to jolt someone to their core? What if that whisper wasn't meant for Sarah Ferguson's ears at all? And what if it contained just enough emotion, just enough tension, just enough danger to make her stop mid-step and think, wait, why would Meghan say that to Andrew? That's the question you need to hold on to, because it's the moment everything begins to unravel. Picture this. A calm afternoon inside Royal Lodge, the kind of afternoon where everything feels deceptively normal. Staff moving quietly, doors clicking shut, sunlight filtering through tall windows. Sarah walks down the corridor with no intention other than checking on a planned event. She isn't suspicious. She isn't searching for anything. She isn't expecting the air to feel strange or heavy. She's simply moving through the home she knows better than most. And that's when she hears it. A soft, tense sentence. Meghan's voice. Low, controlled, carrying a kind of urgency Sarah had never heard from her before. Followed by Andrew's reply, quieter, unsure, almost nervous. The kind of tone he didn't use with just anyone. Sarah stops. She doesn't mean to listen. It just happens. How could it not? When someone speaks in a tone that feels forbidden, your instincts wake up before your mind even decides what to do. And Sarah's instincts were suddenly roaring. Here's the thing. The royal world teaches you to ignore what isn't your business, even when it sounds like it should be. But the whisper she heard didn't feel like typical royal drama. It felt personal. It felt private. It felt like the beginning of something that would later make perfect, uncomfortable sense. Let me ask you this. Have you ever overheard a conversation that felt like a puzzle piece sliding into place, even before you had the rest of the puzzle? That's exactly what hit Sarah in that hallway. One whisper that didn't make sense at the time, but refused to leave her mind afterward. The sentence itself was simple, almost too simple. But the tone? The timing? The way Andrew's reply dipped into something that sounded less like formality and more like connection? That was the part that made Sarah pause. That whisper became the first thread in a web she didn't want to see, but couldn't avoid once she'd heard it. She continued walking, because what else could she do? But the energy in that hallway followed her, haunted her, not in the dramatic, movie-style way, in the slow, creeping, unsettling way where your intuition keeps tapping on your shoulder saying, "Look again. Pay attention. Something's not right." Later that day, Sarah's mind replayed the moment more times than she wanted to admit. Why was Meghan speaking to Andrew in that tone? Why were they alone? Why did the conversation stop the moment footsteps approached? Why did Andrew look almost startled? Those questions didn't form accusations, not yet. They formed discomfort, curiosity, confusion, the kind you can ignore once, maybe twice, but never forever. That whisper planted a seed. And here's the emotional contradiction that made everything harder for Sarah. She didn't want to suspect anything. She didn't want to see Meghan that way. She didn't want to believe Andrew could be involved in anything sensitive again. And she certainly didn't want to entertain a scenario where the two of them might have formed a connection outside the boundaries of what was acceptable. But sometimes life doesn't care what you want to believe. Sometimes it hands you a truth you're not prepared for. As the days passed, small details started to stand out. Little things she would normally never think twice about suddenly gained meaning because of that whisper. And the more she noticed, the more she wondered if the universe had nudged her intentionally. Like that whisper was meant to crack open a door she had never even considered opening. Let's talk about the first sign after the whisper. It came during a family gathering. Casual, friendly, normal. But something about Meghan's interaction with Andrew made Sarah narrow her eyes just slightly. Meghan placed her hand on Andrew's arm during a joke. It was brief. It was light. It was almost nothing. But it wasn't nothing. Not after the hallway whisper. Because the look on Andrew's face changed. Subtle, quick, but real. Almost like that simple touch carried a memory, one Sarah didn't know existed. And Meghan? She looked too comfortable, too familiar, too aware of the effect she had. Ever noticed a moment between two people that didn't look wrong, but also didn't look right? That's what Sarah saw. A flicker, a fragment, a spark that shouldn't have been there. And again, she questioned herself. Was she overthinking? Was she imagining things? Was she reading too much into one moment? She wanted to believe yes. She really did. But then came the second sign. During a private conversation between Meghan and a staff member, Sarah caught something strange. Meghan mentioned Andrew in a tone that sounded almost protective, like she was defending him from criticism, like she cared in a way that went beyond typical family concern. And the staff member, caught off guard, tried to change the subject. But Meghan kept going, emphasizing Andrew's side of a story Sarah didn't even know Meghan had access to. How did she know that? Why did she care enough to defend him? And why did she sound emotional while doing it? These weren't random coincidences anymore. They were patterns. Patterns wrapped in contradictions. Because Meghan publicly acted indifferent toward Andrew. Polite, distant, respectful, but not close. Yet privately, Sarah was beginning to see cracks. Moments that said the relationship was more layered, more complicated, more personal. But here's the twist. Meghan didn't know Sarah was watching. She didn't know Sarah was noticing these micro moments. She didn't know that one whisper had sharpened Sarah's attention to a level that made her see everything differently. And Andrew? He had no idea Sarah was quietly reading between the lines, connecting pieces he didn't realize he'd dropped. It all became clearer one evening when Sarah walked into a sitting room unexpectedly. Meghan and Andrew were standing close. Too close to be casual, too far to be explicitly inappropriate, but close enough to make Sarah freeze for half a second. Meghan stepped back immediately, overly quickly. Andrew cleared his throat and made an awkward joke. Neither of them looked comfortable. Tell me, doesn't that sound like people with something to hide? Still, Sarah said nothing. Because suspicion is not evidence, and observation is not confirmation. But by now, her intuition had turned into a quiet alarm ringing in her chest. Have you ever reached a point where you're afraid your imagination might be telling the truth? That's where Sarah found herself. Then came the moment she couldn't ignore. The moment that shook her enough to realize the whisper wasn't random. It was the beginning. Meghan was leaving Royal Lodge late one evening. Sarah just happened to be near the staircase as Meghan descended. And there it was again, that tone. That soft, private, intimate tone, directed not at Harry, not at staff, but at Andrew, who followed silently behind her. Sarah didn't catch the full sentence, only the ending. You know I meant it. For words. For devastating words. Meant what? Why tell Andrew at night? What private conversation had preceded this moment? And why did Andrew look conflicted? This was no longer a theory. This was no longer curiosity. This was no longer Sarah imagining scenarios. She had heard enough, seen enough, felt enough to know something deeper was unfolding. Something hidden, something charged, something everyone else had missed. And the most frightening part? Meghan and Andrew seemed to think nobody was paying attention. They underestimated Sarah. They didn't consider her someone who noticed patterns. Someone who connected emotional dots. Someone who could read body language like a book written in bold letters. Someone who could see beyond surface pleasantries straight into the truth people tried to bury. That whisper, that one moment, became the gateway. And it led to a realization Sarah wished she could unhear. Because as she stood there on the staircase watching Meghan leave and watching Andrew linger behind her, unable to meet Sarah's eyes, something clicked. This wasn't random. This wasn't innocent. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was the beginning of a story Sarah never expected to witness. And the truth hiding inside it. That was far, far more dangerous than anyone realized. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Have you ever watched two people meet for the very first time and felt something shift in the room? Something subtle, something electric, something you couldn't fully explain but couldn't fully ignore either? That's exactly what happened the day Meghan Markle and Prince Andrew first crossed paths inside the royal world. And the strangest part? Nobody expected the interaction to matter. Not then, not later, not at all. Yet Sarah Ferguson would look back on that moment as the spark that lit a fire neither Meghan nor Andrew could hide forever. Let's rewind. Not to the scandal, not to the whisper, not to the late-night encounters, but to the beginning. Because stories like this don't erupt out of nowhere. They grow from seeds planted quietly long before anyone realizes what kind of storm might come. Picture the setting. An early summer reception, polished silver trays, staff moving quietly, polite laughter drifting through the rooms of a residence that had seen decades of royal gatherings. Nothing unusual, nothing extraordinary. Meghan had been introduced to the royal circle not too long before this, still navigating the expectations, still stepping carefully, still trying to interpret the unspoken rules everyone else seemed born knowing. And then Andrew entered the room. Sarah remembered the moment in vivid detail, not because of anything dramatic, but because of what didn't happen. Andrew didn't greet Meghan the way he greeted others. He didn't offer the practiced smile. He didn't offer the standard formal warmth. His reaction was different. He paused, just for a second, but long enough for Sarah, seasoned in reading micro-expressions, to register it. A pause that shouldn't have existed. A flicker of curiosity. A subtle shift in posture. A look of recognition where none should have been. Was it interest? Was it surprise? Was it something else entirely? Sarah didn't know then, but she would remember it later, replay it in her mind, and wonder how she ever missed the significance. Meanwhile, Meghan, ever confident, ever poised, stepped forward with that Hollywood charm she wore like a perfectly tailored accessory. She reached out her hand, smiled, and said something Sarah couldn't quite hear. But the reaction was unmistakable. Andrew laughed softly, too softly, almost shyly. And for a moment that lasted longer than polite introductions required, he kept holding her hand. You know that feeling when you see two people meet, and there's an instant pull? A gravity? A strange recognition? That's what Sarah sensed. Not romance. Not scandal. Something more subtle. A current. A curiosity. A tension wrapped under layers of protocol. But here comes the contradiction. Nothing looked inappropriate. Nothing looked suspicious. It was all smooth, polished civility. A perfectly acceptable introduction between a new family member and an older one. If Sarah had told anyone at the time that something felt off, they would have dismissed her instantly. Yet her instincts didn't forget it. As the event continued, Meghan and Andrew crossed paths again and again. Not in obvious ways. Not in ways that screamed interest. But in ways that hinted that both were aware of each other's presence, even when surrounded by dozens of people. At one point, Meghan made a comment during a group conversation, something clever, sharp, lightly teasing. Andrew laughed harder than everyone else. A bit too loudly, a bit too eagerly. And Meghan's expression shifted into something Sarah recognized instantly: approval. She liked the reaction. She liked the attention. She liked the validation. Did she mean anything by it? Did she know what message it sent? Did she understand how closely Sarah was observing? These were questions Sarah wouldn't ask herself until much, much later. But the most unusual part of their first encounter came at the end of the event. The moment that made Sarah frown without understanding why. Meghan was preparing to leave. Staff shuffled coats and bags. Harry was nearby, speaking to someone else. And Andrew walked past Meghan just as she turned to go. What happened next looked innocent to anyone who wasn't paying attention. A brief exchange. A soft comment. A glance held half a second too long. A smile from Andrew that didn't match the reserved tone he had maintained all evening. And then Meghan's reply. Quiet, warm, strangely gentle. A tone Sarah would only understand years later, when everything snapped into place. But let's pause here, because this isn't just about body language or facial expressions. This is about what both Meghan and Andrew lacked at the time, and how two people missing something can gravitate toward each other unexpectedly. Meghan, new to the royal hierarchy, lacked allies. Real ones. Trusted ones. She didn't have strong roots in the institution, and her personality, bold and expressive, clashed with the rigidity around her. She needed people who wouldn't judge her. People who wouldn't corner her. People who wouldn't correct her every move. Andrew, meanwhile, lacked acceptance. He lacked respect. He lacked the status he once held. Scandal had carved away his place in the public sphere. He was fragile, isolated, cautious, and maybe, deep down, desperate for someone, anyone, to look at him without the shadow of his past hovering over their eyes. Two people with vulnerabilities they didn't speak of. Two people searching for connection. Two people who met at the exact wrong or right moment. But here comes the twist that still haunts Sarah. Nothing improper happened that first day. Nothing undeniable. Nothing that screamed danger or intimacy or scandal. So why did she remember it? Why did her instincts feel triggered? Why did that first encounter stay with her like a puzzle piece she didn't yet have the rest of the puzzle for? Because, as she would later learn, first encounters can be harmless, or they can be the quiet beginning of something that unravels lives. The next time Meghan and Andrew saw each other, their interaction flowed more easily. Too easily. Like they had established a private rapport that didn't exist before. Meghan joked with him in a way she didn't with other senior royals. Andrew listened to her more intently than necessary. Meghan asked him a question that sounded casual but carried emotional weight. Andrew answered with softness she hadn't seen him give to anyone else. And Sarah stood across the room watching all of it. Not with suspicion, not with judgment, with confusion, with curiosity, with a strange sense that she was witnessing the start of a story she didn't want to be part of. Now, here's where the contradictions start to tighten. Because Meghan acted cold toward Andrew in public. Not rude, not disrespectful, but cool, controlled, avoidant, as if she didn't want the world seeing any warmth. But in private circles, the warmth returned. The tone softened. The connection reappeared. Ever deal with someone who behaves differently depending on who's watching? It makes you wonder what their real feelings are and what they're trying to hide. Sarah noticed this dual behavior. She filed it away, and she didn't forget it. One specific moment cemented her growing discomfort. At a small, informal gathering, Meghan and Andrew ended up standing near each other at the edge of a conversation about royal responsibilities. Meghan made a comment. Something witty, slightly teasing, undeniably personal. The kind of comment you make only to someone you know well enough to gauge their reaction. Andrew turned bright red. Not flustered. Not embarrassed. Red. And he smiled. Not a polite smile. Not a forced smile. A smile Sarah had not seen from him in years. You know that feeling when you see a reaction that betrays an emotion someone doesn't want the world to see? That's the moment Sarah felt a chill. Not fear. Not suspicion. Something else. Something she couldn't name. But later, she found the word recognition. Because years later, when everything escalated, when whispers turned into patterns, when patterns turned into secrets, when secrets turned into something undeniably dangerous, she would trace it all back to that day. That first meeting. That first exchange. That first spark neither Meghan nor Andrew realized anyone else noticed. And the most disturbing part? Sarah realized she wasn't just witnessing the beginning of a connection. She was witnessing the beginning of a problem. But she had no idea how far that problem would go. No idea how deeply it would tangle itself into the heart of the royal family. No idea how many nights she would lie awake replaying that first encounter, wondering how she didn't see the storm forming right in front of her. Because what came after their first meeting wasn't coincidence. It wasn't harmless. It wasn't misunderstood. And it wasn't something either of them ever intended Sarah to uncover. But what happened next would push the boundary from suspicion into undeniable reality. And no one, absolutely no one, saw it coming. What if the truth you've been trying to avoid is hiding not in broad daylight, but behind a door you were never meant to open? What if the moment that changes everything isn't loud, dramatic, or obvious, but quiet, accidental, and so subtle that only someone with Sarah Ferguson's instincts would even notice it? Because that's exactly how the next turning point unfolded. Not with a scandalous scene, not with a confrontation, but with one single moment Sarah stumbled into literally, on a day that was supposed to be uneventful. A moment behind a closed door at Royal Lodge that made her heart stop cold and forced her to question whether the whisper she heard and the strange interactions she observed were just coincidences, or the beginning of something far more dangerous. Let's set the scene. Royal Lodge, a sprawling estate with winding hallways, deep carpets that swallow footsteps, and rooms layered with decades of royal history. It's the kind of place that sees everything but says nothing, where secrets can live in silence because the walls have learned to keep them. On this particular afternoon, Sarah wasn't hunting for answers. She wasn't trying to spy. She wasn't even thinking about Meghan or Andrew. She was simply searching for a binder. Yes, something as mundane as that. A binder left behind after a staff meeting. The kind of errand she'd done 1,000 times without a second thought. But fate, or something that felt disturbingly similar, had other plans. As Sarah walked past one of the smaller sitting rooms, she noticed the door was slightly ajar. Not wide open, not fully closed. Just enough to suggest the room was either unoccupied or someone had forgotten to shut it properly. Normally, Sarah would ignore it and keep walking, but something made her pause. Maybe it was intuition. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was that whisper echoing in her memory. Whatever it was, she stepped closer. And that's when she heard it. Not words. Not whispers. Not even full sentences. Just sound. The kind of sound that doesn't belong in a quiet sitting room in the middle of the afternoon. A soft, breathy tone. A tone of closeness. A tone of intimacy. Not sexual, not explicit, but emotionally charged in a way that froze Sarah mid-step. For half a second, she thought she was imagining it. Until she heard Andrew's voice. Low, uneven, vulnerable. She had never heard him speak like that. Not in public. Not in private. Not even to her, despite all their history. Her hand hovered near the door. She didn't push it open. She didn't barge in. She simply stood there, eyes wide, heart pounding, listening to a kind of emotional energy that didn't belong between two people who should have been nothing more than in-laws. Then Meghan's voice drifted out again, quiet, soft, reassuring. A tone that said she wasn't comforting a friend or offering polite conversation. She was connecting, deeply, meaningfully, in a way that felt alarmingly private. Have you ever heard a sound that felt like crossing a line without seeing anything with your eyes? That's what this felt like to Sarah. She wanted to step back. She wanted to move away. She wanted to pretend she didn't hear anything. But her feet refused to move. She took a slow breath and carefully, silently, leaned back just enough to glance through the gap of the door. What she saw wasn't scandalous in the physical sense, but it was devastating in the emotional sense. Meghan and Andrew were sitting on opposite ends of a love seat, close enough that their knees were almost touching, but far enough to appear innocent if anyone walked in. Meghan had one leg crossed over the other, leaning forward just slightly, her hand resting on the arm of the sofa. Andrew mirrored her body language. Leaning in, shoulders relaxed in a way Sarah hadn't seen in months, eyes fixed on Meghan as though she were the only person in the world who understood him. It wasn't what they were doing. It was how they were doing it. Their proximity, their tone, their expressions, their silence. Because silence can be louder than speech when two people share something unspoken. Sarah's stomach flipped. She watched for maybe 3 seconds. Just long enough to see a look pass between them that didn't belong between two people who barely knew each other. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't flirtatious. It was something worse: familiarity, trust, emotional nakedness. And then Meghan reached out. Not dramatically, not boldly, not seductively, just a light touch. A hand gently resting on Andrew's forearm. A gesture of comfort, of reassurance, of emotional connection. And Andrew didn't pull back. He let her touch linger. He closed his eyes for a split second, as if that touch meant more to him than it should have. That was the moment Sarah knew. Something was happening. Something subtle. Something dangerous. Something hidden. Her breath caught in her throat. She stepped back, heart pounding, and forced herself to continue walking down the hall. Every instinct in her screamed to go back, to knock, to interrupt, to demand an explanation, but logic held her back. Interrupting them would reveal she'd seen something she wasn't supposed to see. And if she was wrong, if she misinterpreted anything, it would lead to chaos she wasn't prepared to unleash. So she kept walking, but the image stayed burned in her mind. Meghan's gentle hand on Andrew's arm. Andrew's soft, vulnerable expression. The closeness, the energy, the silence that said more than words ever could. Tell me this. If you saw two people sitting like that, close enough to share breath, connected enough to read each other's emotions, would you call it innocent? Would you dismiss it as nothing? Would you shrug it off as friendly conversation? Sarah tried. She truly tried. But that moment behind the half-closed door gnawed at her, because it connected too many dots. The whisper in the hallway, the strange tone during their first meeting, the too long eye contact at the second gathering, the way Meghan defended Andrew when no one asked her to. The subtle warmth between them that flickered in and out like a candle caught in a draft. And now this. This wasn't imagination. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't something she could pretend not to see anymore. This was the first undeniable sign that Meghan and Andrew shared a private world no one else had access to. But here's where it gets even more unsettling. Later that evening, Sarah walked past the sitting room again. The door was closed this time, firmly. No light. No voices. Silence. But she had a feeling. A deep, cold feeling. Because when she looked toward the far end of the corridor, she saw Meghan walking away, fixing her hair, and Andrew exiting the room just 30 seconds later, his head down, his hand pressed to his forehead, as if trying to steady himself. Their eyes avoided each other, but their energy did not. That was the moment Sarah realized she wasn't imagining anything. Something was happening behind closed doors. Something neither of them wanted anyone to know. But what Sarah didn't yet realize was this. The moment she witnessed through that half-open door was just the beginning. Because what came next would force her to confront a truth she never wanted to face. One that would twist everything she thought she knew. And when the next piece of evidence fell into her hands, it wouldn't be subtle. It would be undeniable. And it would change everything. Have you ever had someone confide in you so suddenly, so intensely, that it made you wonder, why me? Why now? And what exactly are they trying to reveal or conceal? That's the question Sarah Ferguson found herself asking the first time Meghan Markle decided to speak to her in a tone that crossed the boundary between casual conversation and deliberate, strategic vulnerability. Because this chapter isn't about what Sarah saw between Meghan and Andrew. It's about what Meghan said. And what she said changed everything. Let's rewind to a moment that seemed harmless on the surface. A late morning at Royal Lodge, mild weather, staff bustling softly around, and Sarah heading toward the conservatory for tea. She wasn't expecting company. She wasn't expecting drama. She wasn't expecting Meghan. But Meghan was already there, standing near the wide windows, sunlight catching the edges of her hair, phone in hand, eyes tense. She spun around when she heard footsteps, her expression shifting instantly into something soft, almost rehearsed. "Oh, Sarah," she said. "Do you have a minute?" It was the tone that made Sarah pause. Meghan didn't sound casual. She sounded deliberate, like she had chosen this moment specifically, like she had waited for Sarah to walk in. You know that feeling when someone asks you a simple question, but the way they ask it tells you the conversation will not be simple at all? That's what hit Sarah then. She approached slowly. Meghan gestured to the chairs. They sat, and then Meghan began. Not with gossip, not with pleasantries, not with small talk, but with a complaint. Soft, emotional, carefully constructed. I don't understand why certain people look at me a certain way, Meghan said, staring out the window. I try. I really try. But some people in this family have already made up their minds about me. Sarah blinked. Which people? Who was she referring to? Why bring this up? Before she could ask, Meghan continued. It's like they judge me without knowing me, she said with a sad laugh. Except Andrew. He's been surprisingly kind. Sarah's stomach tightened. Meghan said his name so casually, so easily, so comfortably, and yet her tone carried a weight that didn't match casual admiration. It carried familiarity. Sarah tried to keep her face neutral. Meghan wasn't looking at her, anyway. Meghan was focused on her own reflection in the glass, her expression soft but calculating, like someone who wanted to appear vulnerable without actually being vulnerable. Have you ever listened to someone talk about a person and felt something unsaid vibrating beneath every sentence? That was the moment Sarah realized Meghan wasn't venting. She was revealing something. Or maybe she was testing Sarah, trying to gauge how much she knew or how much she suspected. Andrew understands me, Meghan added quietly. He listens. You know how rare that is. Sarah didn't answer. She couldn't, because there were too many possible meanings behind that sentence. Does understands me mean emotional empathy? Does it mean shared secrets? Does it mean something deeper? Something inappropriate? Something hidden? Before Sarah could form a response, Meghan leaned in. And I trust him, she said softly. In a way I can't trust the others. Sarah's pulse kicked. Trust? Why trust Andrew more than others? What had he done for her? What had she told him? What had he told her? It was too much. Too personal. Too revealing. But Meghan wasn't done. She shifted in her chair, lowering her voice. You know, sometimes I feel like Andrew sees parts of me nobody else notices. There it was. The sentence that made Sarah's breath catch. Parts of me. Nobody else sees. Why would Meghan say this to her? Why would she hint at such emotional closeness? Why would she frame it as if the connection was unique, special, even intimate? Sarah stayed silent, letting Meghan talk. Because this wasn't a confession. It was a pattern, a breadcrumb, a warning, or maybe a slip. Meghan looked over her shoulder, not at Sarah, but toward the hallway, as if making sure no one was listening, as if the conversation itself was a secret. Then she sighed. Honestly, Sarah, I don't know what I'd do without him. That was the line that made everything inside Sarah freeze, because it didn't sound like a light, passing compliment. It sounded like attachment, need, dependence. And there is nothing more dangerous than emotional dependence between two people who are supposed to have nothing more than polite family ties. But Meghan wasn't finished. She began complaining about the pressures she felt, the criticism she endured, the way the others treated her. It sounded heartfelt. But some parts felt too pointed, too dramatic, too curated. Like she was building a case. Like she was constructing a narrative. Like she was positioning herself as misunderstood and Andrew as her lifeline. Why? What was she trying to gain? Influence? Protection? Leverage? Or was it something deeper? Then came the twist Sarah didn't expect. Meghan leaned closer, lowered her voice even more, and said, Andrew told me something the other day. Something he doesn't tell many people. Sarah's heart lurched. What did he tell her? Why her? Why not family? Why not Sarah? But Meghan paused. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't explain. She didn't clarify. Instead, she smiled softly and said, Never mind. It's nothing. That sentence, that never mind, was not nothing. It was everything. Because it wasn't a dismissal. It was a tease. A signal. A breadcrumb dropped intentionally. The kind of breadcrumb that says, there is more here. Much more. But I'm not ready to say it yet. Sarah's mind began spinning. Was Meghan manipulating her? Was Meghan confiding too much on purpose? Was Meghan trying to see how Sarah reacted to Andrew's name? Was Meghan gauging whether Sarah knew something? Or was Meghan just careless? Caught in an emotional swirl she didn't know how to control? The contradictions collided in Sarah's mind. Meghan spoke like someone who needed Andrew, but she behaved like someone who wanted to hide something. She confided in Sarah like a friend, but she withheld key details like someone guarding a secret. And then it happened. The moment that shattered Sarah's last attempt at rationalizing everything. Meghan looked down at her phone, saw a message, smiled, deeply, warmly, and said, Oh, that's him. He's checking in on me. Her voice changed. Warmer, softer, more intimate than any tone she had used while talking about Harry or anyone else. She didn't say Andrew's name. She didn't have to. The smile told Sarah everything, and Sarah felt her chest tighten with a realization that settled in her bones. The connection wasn't one-sided. It wasn't imagined. It wasn't accidental. It was mutual. But here's the most devastating twist. This wasn't the moment that confirmed Meghan and Andrew's emotional closeness. This was the moment Sarah realized Meghan wanted her to know about it. Why? What was the motive? Was Meghan seeking validation? Reassurance? Support? Cover? Or was she trying to hint at something without fully confessing it? Whatever the reason, Meghan's strategy became clear. She confided just enough to evoke curiosity, but not enough to expose anything fully. She wanted Sarah to feel included, but not informed. She wanted to share the emotion, but not the evidence. But Meghan didn't count on one thing. Sarah saw through it. Not immediately, not all at once, but piece by piece. Because everything Meghan said in that conservatory fit too perfectly with everything Sarah had already seen. The emotional tone, the late-night whisper, the closed-door moment, the way Andrew's expression changed, and the final blow? Meghan left the room with a soft, cryptic line. He really trusts me, you know, more than anyone thinks. Then she walked away, leaving Sarah in silence, holding her breath, feeling the ground shift beneath her. Because trust, real trust, doesn't form that quickly. Not in that world. Not between those two. Unless something happened. Something emotional. Something private. Something intimate. Something that had already begun long before Sarah realized it. But what came next would rip away the last traces of doubt. Because the very next encounter wouldn't involve whispers or conversations. It would involve evidence. Undeniable, shocking, impossible to ignore evidence. And no one, not even Meghan, could explain it away. Have you ever noticed how the most dangerous secrets aren't the ones shouted or scribbled or documented? They're the ones that happen quietly, repeatedly, and just out of sight? The ones that slip beneath schedules, avoid public calendars, and occur in those stolen pockets of time nobody thinks to question? That's exactly how Meghan Markle and Prince Andrew's private meetings unfolded. Not dramatic, not scandalous at first glance, but consistent enough that Sarah Ferguson began to feel the truth tightening around her like a cold hand closing on her spine. And this chapter is where subtle moments turn into undeniable patterns, because nothing is more suspicious than a repeated coincidence. Let's go back to the first meeting Sarah didn't mean to notice. It was a mild afternoon, the sky filled with that pale English sunlight that makes shadows softer but tensions sharper. Meghan had arrived at Royal Lodge unexpectedly. No formal event, no prearranged plan, no reason that made sense. She stepped inside with confidence, offering casual greetings, smiling warmly, but something about her presence felt off. Not wrong, but deliberate, intentional. Sarah was in the hallway when Meghan entered. She didn't think much of it until she saw Andrew come downstairs almost immediately afterward. Not slowly, not casually, not with polite surprise. He came down with the pace of someone who was waiting for someone. That someone was Meghan. Their eyes met halfway down the staircase. Not long, not dramatic, but charged, as if they were silently acknowledging something the rest of the world wasn't supposed to see. Meghan smiled, small but meaningful. Andrew's expression shifted, shoulders relaxing, jaw unclenching. And Sarah, who had witnessed tens of thousands of social interactions in royal spaces, could tell instantly. This wasn't a greeting between distant relatives. It felt like two people sliding comfortably back into a private rhythm. You ever see two people greet each other with the kind of ease that only comes from shared secrets? That's what Sarah saw. But the truly unsettling part? They disappeared. Literally. Within minutes, they walked off together, not toward the main sitting room where guests normally go, but toward one of the smaller, older wings of Royal Lodge. The kind of wing that isn't used often. The kind of wing that doesn't get much foot traffic. The kind that's quiet, too quiet. And the strangest part? They didn't take staff with them. No aide, no protection officer, no assistant. Not a single person followed them, which broke protocol in a way Sarah didn't understand. Where did they go? What were they doing? Why did it feel planned? Sarah didn't follow, not then. She had no reason to. But the moment unsettled her enough that she remembered it long after she tried to forget. Then it happened again. A few days later, Meghan arrived early for a lunch gathering. Earlier than anyone else. Earlier than she had any reason to. She slipped in quietly, spoke briefly to a staff member, and then walked straight toward the library, one of the quietest rooms on the estate. Minutes later, Andrew followed. This time, Sarah felt the tension hit her stomach like a stone. 2 unannounced meetings? In less than a week? Both in secluded locations? Both timed within minutes of each other? Coincidence is patient. Coincidence is subtle. But coincidence is rarely this consistent. And then came the 3rd meeting. This one Sarah witnessed directly. It was early evening, the sky dim, the halls quiet. She was on her way toward the back patio when she saw something that froze her steps mid-stride. Meghan slipping out of a side corridor. The one that leads to the old reading room. Alone. Her expression calm. Her pace slow. Her phone tucked away as if she wanted no evidence on hand. Seconds later, Andrew stepped out of the same corridor. Not with her. Not beside her. But close enough behind her that Sarah knew they had been in the same room. Alone. Undisturbed. For a period of time Sarah could not measure. Neither of them looked at each other as they exited. In fact, they avoided eye contact altogether. Too much so. Like actors trying to conceal a scene the director didn't approve. Have you ever watched 2 people pretend they weren't together moments after clearly being together? That was exactly the energy. Sarah's chest tightened. Her mind raced. And her instincts screamed. But she said nothing. Because suspicion without evidence is still just suspicion. But then the meetings became deliberate. You can always tell when something shifts from chance to choice, and the next moment made that shift impossible to ignore. One evening, Sarah was speaking with a longtime staff member when the topic of household schedules came up. Harmless. Routine. But then, casually, the staff member mentioned something that punched the air from Sarah's lungs. Mrs. Sussex was asking earlier what time the Duke's meetings ended today. She said she didn't want to disturb him. Sarah's eyebrows rose. Meghan had asked about Andrew's schedule. Why? For what purpose? What information did she need? And why phrase it as though avoiding disturbance mattered? Because here's the truth. Nobody asks about Andrew's schedule unless they need something from him. Nobody checks timing unless they intend to overlap. Sarah didn't respond right away. She didn't trust herself to. But the staff member wasn't finished. Oh, and she asked which rooms he prefers working in lately. Very polite, of course. Just curious, she said. Curious? No. Curiosity doesn't look like that. Curiosity doesn't follow patterns, or times, or room selections. Curiosity doesn't position itself around privacy. Curiosity doesn't mirror emotional dependence. Curiosity doesn't lead to closed doors and secluded wings. What Meghan was doing wasn't curiosity. It was coordination. Sarah didn't want to admit that. Not yet. But her instincts had shifted beyond uneasiness. The feeling walking through her veins was sharper now. Clearer. Alarming. And that feeling only intensified with the next meeting. Because this time, Sarah saw Meghan emerging from Andrew's study. Not politely at the doorway. Not stepping out as though she had knocked. But walking out confidently, like someone who was fully comfortable being there. Alone, unannounced, inside the room of a man who, by protocol, shouldn't have been receiving informal visits from her at all. And then the question that haunted Sarah the rest of the day. Why wasn't Andrew surprised to see her leave? He didn't look startled. He didn't look confused. He didn't look uncomfortable. He looked normal, as if this had happened before, as if this was a habit, as if this was their pattern. That night, when Sarah lay awake staring at the ceiling, she replayed every meeting in her mind. Meghan arriving early. Meghan arriving unannounced. Andrew following minutes later. Doors closing. Voices soft. Energy strange. Silence charged. Avoided eye contact afterward. Coordinated timing. Coordinated rooms. This was no longer something she could push aside. And then came the moment that removed all doubt. A staff member, trying to be helpful, made an innocent comment. It's nice to see the Duchess and the Duke getting along so well. They spend quite a bit of time together, don't they? Sarah's blood ran cold. Time together. Enough to be noticeable. Enough for staff to assume it was intentional. Enough for people who don't typically observe emotional subtleties to observe frequency. And you know what they say? When staff notice something, it's no longer small. But here comes the twist, the part that nearly knocked Sarah breathless. The staff member added, "They're clever with timing too. Sometimes one leaves through the gardens, the other through the corridor. Very efficient. Efficient. Efficient." That was the word that broke everything in Sarah's mind. Because efficiency doesn't happen accidentally. Efficiency requires planning, coordination, communication. It requires purpose. That night, Sarah finally accepted the truth she'd been resisting. Meghan and Andrew weren't meeting accidentally. They weren't interacting randomly. They weren't stumbling into each other's presence. They were arranging it. They were choosing it. They were protecting it. But what were they sharing? What emotional currency were they trading? What private bond were they building? And how deep had it already gone? Sarah didn't have the answers yet. Not then. But she was sickeningly close to the truth. Because the next piece of evidence wouldn't be subtle. It wouldn't be whispered. It wouldn't be hidden behind body language. It would be written, recorded, documented. And when Sarah saw it, her heart dropped through the floor. Because it wasn't just suspicious. It was explosive. And it would confirm, without question, that the secret meetings were not innocent at all. What if the one piece of evidence that shatters your denial doesn't come crashing into your life with noise and chaos, but slips quietly into your hands like it was always meant to find you? What if the truth you've been trying to explain away, rationalize, and ignore suddenly becomes undeniable? Not because of something you saw, but because of something you weren't supposed to see at all. This is the chapter where subtle suspicion turns into hard, pulsing, irrefutable proof. And it began with something so small, so ordinary, so deceptively harmless. A phone. Not Meghan's, not Andrew's, not even Sarah's, but a phone left behind, carelessly, innocently, fatefully, on the wrong table at the wrong moment. A phone Sarah picked up without thinking, intending only to return it to its owner, until the screen lit up with a message that made her blood run cold. Let's go back to the day it happened. It was late afternoon at Royal Lodge, the kind of day where everything feels still, air heavy with humidity, doors open for ventilation, footsteps muted by thick carpets. Sarah had just finished reviewing event plans when she noticed a phone sitting alone on the edge of a side table, its case unfamiliar, its presence out of place. She assumed it belonged to one of the staff. She reached for it to bring it to the lost and found drawer. That's when the screen lit up. One notification. Just one. A preview of a message. And that preview was enough to make her breath hitch. It read, "Same time as last week. No one will notice. No name. No details. Just the preview." But beneath it, the sender. Andrew. Her stomach twisted into a knot so sharp she nearly dropped the phone. Andrew sent that message. To this phone. To whoever owned it. And if the sender was Andrew, who was the recipient? Sarah's heart pounded in her ears as she stared at the device in her hands. Her mind raced through every possibility. Staff, security, a friend, anyone but the one person she feared the most. But as soon as she pressed the lock button to confirm whose phone it was, her world tilted. The screensaver lit up. A photo. Clear. Unmistakable. Meghan. Sarah blinked. Once. Twice. 3 times. Her brain refused to accept what her eyes were showing her. Meghan had left her phone behind, and Andrew had messaged her. Directly. Casually. Comfortably. Same time as last week. No one will notice. That sentence. That tone. That ease. It wasn't just a text. It was a confession in plain sight. Sarah swallowed hard. Her hands trembled ever so slightly as she placed the phone back on the table, terrified of seeing more, but even more terrified of looking away. She didn't want to look at the screen again. But she did. Because some truths don't let you walk away. With a breath she didn't realize she was holding, she tapped the notifications to expand the preview. Still not unlocking the phone, still not invading privacy, but looking just long enough to see one more line. The second line of the message was even worse. Last time was perfect. You always know how to slip out. Slip out. Slip out. Slip out of what? Slip out from where? Slip out with whom? Her knees felt weak. These weren't innocent words. These weren't ambiguous phrases. These weren't lines that could be explained away with excuses. They were intentional. They were familiar. They were practiced. Because you don't talk like that unless you've done something more than once. Unless you've met secretly before. Unless you've coordinated. Planned. Hidden. Unless there's something to slip out for. Sarah took one step back, placing her hand on the back of a chair to steady herself. The room suddenly felt colder. The air thicker. The walls closer. This was the evidence she had been trying not to find. And now it was staring her in the face. She walked out of the room slowly, quietly, as if afraid the phone might explode if she moved too fast. Her mind was spinning. Images, whispers, moments, conversations, all crashing into her with a force that made her chest tighten. The whisper in the hallway, the too long looks, the closed-door moment in the sitting room, the staff comments, the match schedules, the synchronized entrances and exits. And now this, a text message that confirmed it was not coincidence, not curiosity, not harmless closeness. It was a plan, a routine, a pattern of secret meetings. But the worst part wasn't the text. The worst part wasn't even the sender. The worst part was what happened next. Because the moment Meghan returned for her phone, smiling, casual, unaware that Sarah had seen the messages, Sarah saw something else. Something she didn't want to see. She saw guilt. Not in Meghan's words. Not in her actions. But in her eyes. An instinctive flicker. A quick, searching glance. Like she was trying to read Sarah, trying to see if anything had been noticed. Sarah said nothing. She simply gestured to the phone. You left this behind. Meghan smiled too quickly, thanked her too sweetly, held the phone too protectively. Then she walked away. But here's the part that made Sarah's heart break a little. Andrew appeared moments later. As though he'd been waiting for her. As though they were supposed to meet again. As though the timing was, once again, perfectly coordinated. He didn't even look surprised to see Meghan holding her phone tightly. He didn't look shocked. He didn't look guilty. He looked relieved. That was the moment Sarah knew the truth had slipped past deniability. They were communicating. They were planning. They were meeting secretly. And they were covering it up. Now, maybe you're thinking, was the message sexual? Romantic? Explicit? No. That's what made it scarier. It wasn't explicit. It was intimate. The kind of intimacy that hides underneath words. The kind that speaks through familiarity. The kind that reveals emotional closeness rather than physical. Emotional intimacy is harder to hide, harder to erase, harder to deny, and far more dangerous. Sarah could no longer pretend the puzzle pieces didn't fit. But fate had more in store for her, because that text message wasn't the only evidence she would find. The pictures were next. The photos Sarah didn't mean to see. Photos that would confirm everything, and rip apart the last thread of denial she'd been clinging to. Because what she stumbled upon next wasn't subtle, wasn't ambiguous, and wasn't something Meghan could talk her way out of. It was proof. Visual. Clear. Undeniable. And it would change everything. Forever. Have you ever walked into a room expecting nothing unusual, only to feel the atmosphere shift in a way you can't explain? Heavy. Tense. Electric. As if the walls themselves knew a secret you weren't supposed to hear? That's exactly what Sarah Ferguson stepped into the night everything changed. The night the truth stopped hiding. The night Meghan and Andrew's connection slipped, finally, into the open. Because if the text message shook Sarah, the pictures shattered her. But before we get to the images, we need to return to the night they were taken. The night the entire royal household attended a charity gala. A glamorous, high-profile event where cameras were everywhere, conversation buzzed like electricity, and every gesture had an audience. It was supposed to be predictable, formal, controlled. But what happened behind the scenes, what Sarah witnessed, was anything but. It began with a single moment, fleeting but unmistakable. Meghan arrived first, dressed in a deep emerald gown, poised, polished, glowing beneath the golden lights. She was all charm, smiling, waving, shaking hands. And yet her eyes kept drifting, searching, scanning the room as though waiting for someone specific. Andrew walked in 10 minutes later. He wasn't scheduled to arrive then. His timing was unusual, and everyone noticed. He slipped in quietly, head low, shoulders tense, avoiding cameras with more caution than usual. But when Meghan saw him, something changed. Her posture softened. Her expression brightened. Her entire demeanor shifted like a signal between two people who weren't supposed to communicate at all. Sarah watched it happen, and she felt her stomach drop. Because she knew that look. She recognized that signal. It was the same energy she'd seen in private rooms, quiet hallways, behind half-open doors. Only this time, they were in public, and neither of them seemed prepared for that. Throughout the reception, Sarah noticed little things. Small gestures that seemed insignificant unless you'd seen the messages, unless you'd witnessed the whispering, unless you'd watched Meghan slip out of Andrew's study as though it were her own. Meghan's gaze lingered on Andrew too long. Andrew's eyes drifted toward Meghan too often. Their conversation stayed too far apart, as if both were terrified of standing too close. Distance can be suspicious, so can avoidance, especially when it's too deliberate. At one point, Meghan brushed past Andrew to greet someone else, not close enough to touch.